So imagine this. You just lost yet another ranked game because clearly your teammates are too heavy for you to carry them. You are so beyond fed up with them, and you suddenly get a strong urge to improve, so you can get out of this hell. So you go to Reddit to look for advice, get the most generic bullshit ever for an answer, and think this is it. This is what will change your gameplay forever. And then you start losing even more thinking you are the most unlucky person to ever exist and that League sends spies just to make you suffer. Well, guess what? While I'm unable to explain Chinese win traders targeting little Timmy from Bronze 3, I can tell you for sure that the advice you read was probably the main reason you started losing more. Apart from you sucking, that is. Few examples of this type of advice would be, just farm better. Don't die. Play more aggressive. Just play better. And all those seem very smart. That's the thing, they are actually not. Kinda. And they are more likely to make you lose LP. I know it seems counterintuitive. How could any advice found on Reddit be bad? Well, the topic is actually a lot more complex than you think, because nothing here is black and white, but I'll try to explain it so that even you can understand. Yes, you, the person to the right. And don't get me wrong, advice like die less or farm better isn't necessarily bad. Long story short, this type of advice has a lot more to it than you may think, and most of the time it's oversimplified, making people focus on wrong things. But to really understand it, first we have to learn where it's all coming from. So basically tutorials and guides have been on internet for ages, and the bigger the game, the more unhinged it takes. Like how many guides are there on YouTube nowadays? Like what the fuck? I swear to God, imagine making guides for games. Anyways, over time people learn more and more about the games, its mechanics, how to read the state of the game, and many more. They develop a deep understanding of the game, and then they try to share their knowledge with others. And depending on the person, you can either get a really good, elaborate advice, or some generic stuff that makes sense only on paper, or an advice that doesn't really apply to you, just because there weren't enough details. And don't get me wrong, advice like die less or farm better isn't necessarily bad. It can be good in theory, but that's the thing. It's only good when there is also explanation on how and why. Without that context, it will be as useful as Yumi. Here is why. The game is simply too complex for a generalized advice. Telling someone to do something that is impacted by 100 other things, without going in depth why, will just end up being harmful. League has a lot more to it than just mechanics. It's about decision-making, map awareness, game knowledge, and many more. And every situation has thousands of possible decisions to make. And when players focus on just one of things, ignoring everything else, they will end up playing much worse, not being able to understand why it's not working. They might think it's just part of the process, as with learning anything new, but unless they understand the reason behind something, the outcome will not be nearly as positive as everyone thinks. Let's take dying less for example. For a new player it might just mean to fight as little as possible and to stay away from the enemies. But none of it would give any good results. You would participate in fights less, might lose more minions because you want to avoid taking damage, or your team will die because you were too scared to walk up. Because you were supposed to die less. For an advanced player, it would mean taking more calculated risks, considering the position of your team more, or even paying more attention to cooldowns, or simply better positioning. But once you are really good at all of those things, you don't even think about them. And here is where the generic advice comes from. It makes a lot of sense for people giving it, but there are simply so many more little things going into it, that it will just not help someone who can't critically think about it. And most people can't do that because, as I mentioned before, the game is too complex, and to really understand this stuff on your own, average player would need thousands of hours of playing. One of the biggest examples of that is the whole drama with Nice. He basically played in Bronze ELO and supposedly struggled with off-meta picks playing for fun. Oh, and here is the struggle in question. And someone made a whole rant post about it, missing the point more than I do IRL, proving how misunderstanding of good concepts can impact you in a negative way. Long story short, they assumed that the fundamentals are not as important, because everyone knows them, and said that Bronze Tryndamere matched Nisa's knowledge on them. He also mentioned how the game wasn't even that close. And as I mentioned, he missed the point, ignored that Nice played for fun, and he was not full on tryharding, and just flamed him. So yes, the delusion hits hard. And I'm not going to talk about certain parts of this post, because it's just as delusional as telling someone to just play better and not make any mistakes, but that's a topic for another video. So the problem with advice like that is, it assumes you already know the baseline behind it. In this example, it being things like positioning, trading, champion knowledge, and all the other small things. And a lot of players don't have all that knowledge, so it's easy for them to misinterpret the advice. And I know it's very problematic, but remember when I mentioned that the advice could be useful? There is actually a fix to that. And worry not, my bronze friends, it's easier than you think. Well, not really, because you have to be reflective and drop your ego, and we all know it's not the strongest side of League players, but it might still help you. Basically, if you want to fix a specific issue, you really have to focus on your own mistakes, not your teammates. And on top of that, you have to try and break down the issue into the smallest pieces possible. For example, if you die a lot, ask yourself why. Was it because of ganks? Or maybe because of bad trades? And once you ask yourself those questions, try to think how you can improve in each of those aspects. That's pretty much all you need to know, but I'll make a video going more in depth into it some other time. So remember, the next time someone tells you to die less, you can either reflect on it in a lot more than most people, or just tell them to put this advice up there. Thanks, bye.